Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Cloak channel. I'm Mr. McGee. Now, I've been off for about a month because, well, the last couple weeks of the school year are always hectic, and rest is what is needed when the school year ends. But rest is now over, I'm back, and we are getting set to tackle the Russian Revolution. Now, in the last video, we took a look at the economic theory of communism, and we really focused on its underlying principles and beliefs. But we said it had never been applied on a countrywide level. Well, in the 20th century, Russia is about to be the first country to try to implement communism. So we're going to take a look at what are the events that led up to the Russian Revolution and what was the aftermath of the Russian Revolution in Russia. So ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. If we're going to understand the Russian Revolution, we have to understand a particular word, Tsar. Now, if you're asking, wait a second, what is a czar? Well, czar is the Russian word for king. Now, sometimes the word czar is spelled C-Z-A-R, sometimes it's spelled T-S-A-R, but what you need to know is czar means king. So, a king is a czar, a queen is a czarina. Russia had been ruled by Russian czars since 1480. Now, to give you an idea of how long ago that was, think about it this way. Christopher Columbus discovered the New World in 1492, and the czars had been ruling Russia since 1480. And a particular family of czars, the Romanovs, began ruling Russia from 1613 all the way until the Russian Revolution in 1917. So the czars under the Romanov line had been ruling Russia for over 300 years. During the Romanov dynasty, a man was born in Simbirsk, Russia in 1870, and this man's name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Now, this is the same Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov who would later be called Vladimir Lenin, the head of the communists in Russia. Now, due to time constraints, we don't exactly have a ton of time to go through all of Vladimir Lenin's life leading up to the revolution, but we will touch on two key points that helped turn him towards communism. The first event that impacted Vladimir's life was the execution of his brother Alexander when Vladimir was 17 years old. His brother was caught in an assassination plot to murder Tsar Alexander Romanov III, the monarch of Russia. Now you may be asking yourself, wait a second, why was his brother involved in an assassination plot? Well, you have to remember, even though Vladimir grew up in a middle-class family and he was pretty well off compared to other people in Russia at that time, you still had no political rights in Russia. The czars were absolute monarchs, meaning whatever they said was law. People had no freedoms, whether they were peasants or, like Vladimir, the middle class. The second event that impacted Vladimir's life was his expulsion from university. Now, I said expulsion, not execution. His brother was executed in 1887. Later that same year, Vladimir was expelled from university for engaging in illegal student protests. Remember what I said before? Absolute monarchies, people have no freedom. That also includes the freedom to protest. So you don't really have freedom of speech in Russia at this time. So he is expelled from university. Well, Vladimir now has some time on his hands, and he begins reading more radical philosophers, and among them, a man named Karl Marx. By 1889, Vladimir Ulyanov declares himself a Marxist, and for the rest of his life, he will have one singular goal: establish Marxist revolutions throughout Europe and cause the proletariat to arise, overthrow the bourgeoisie, overthrow their ruling leaders, and establish proletariat dictatorships throughout Europe. Needless to say, having views like this made him, shall we say, unpopular among the czars in Russia. So in 1895, he was arrested and put in prison for 15 months, then shipped to Siberia, which is the far eastern edge wilderness of Russia, for 3 years. After those 3 years, he and his wife, because he got married at that time, they moved to Munich, Germany. Vladimir's move to Munich, Germany took place in 1900. Around this time, he also took the pseudonym, that means fake name, Lenin. So he became Vladimir Lenin, because it was a lot easier to sneak to different locations and avoid people who might want to do him harm if he used a fake last name instead of his actual name, Ulyanov. You have to remember, there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram, there was no TikTok, so it's not like people recognized him by face, they recognized him by name. So a pseudonym would come in handy during this time. Also, in 1905, Vladimir moved back to Russia from Germany when the 1905 Russian Revolution took place. Now, I know you may be thinking, hey, wait a second, this is the revolution that Mr. McGee's been talking about in this video and the last video. No, it's not. That revolution takes place in 1917, but this revolution is extremely important, and here's why. Now, things in 1905 in Russia were not good. Economically, things were getting worse for the peasantry. Not only that, but Russia had suffered a humiliating defeat to the Japanese in the Japanese-Russo War of 1905. This caused a lot of discontent among the people and a lot of calls for change. So all of a sudden, in most of the major cities, people began to go on strike, they began to protest, there were riots, and there were calls to get rid of the czars. Well, Tsar Nicholas II looked at this and went, oh, this is not good. Okay, you know what I'll do? Guys, I'll put some rules in place, and I will establish a Duma. Duma is the name of the legislature in Russia. So Tsar Nicholas II set up a Duma, an elected Duma that the people could elect their representatives to go to work with the government in creating laws. Well, this lasted about 2 years before Tsar Nicholas II looked at the Duma and said, I hate this. This stinks. They've got way too much power. I want power. So he disbands the Duma. He kicks out a lot of people who were part of the Russian Revolution, among them Vladimir Lenin, who had moved back to Russia. So in 1907, Vladimir Lenin is kicked back out of Russia and he moves to Switzerland. Lenin would live in Switzerland until 1917, still singularly focused on bringing about Marxist revolutions, creating the dictatorship of the proletariat, and basically transforming all of Europe. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to leave Vladimir Lenin in Switzerland just for a little bit because we need to take a look at what is happening throughout Europe. World War I is going to be very important to Lenin leaving Switzerland, heading back to Russia, and the 1917 Russian Revolution happening. Now, if you want to know all the details of World War I have a video in the archives that you can look at that talks about World War I. We are not going to be talking about World War I except for the fact of how it influences Lenin and how it influences Russia. Now, we do need to know the two sides fighting in World War I. On one side, you have Germany, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. They're allied together, so they're fighting on one side. They are fighting against Britain, France, and Russia. Now, if you look at the map, you'll notice that Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire basically split Europe in half. Britain and France are on the Western Front, or the Western side, fighting against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire. Russia is on the Eastern Front. So we need to know that layout with World War I. Now, Lenin is living in Switzerland when World War I breaks out. And for Lenin, he doesn't really care about World War I. He sees World War I as a war of the bourgeoisie, of the rich governments that he wants to overthrow with the proletariat. So he continues to be singularly focused on that vision. Well, to his horror, all of his friends throughout the different countries of Europe who believe what he believes, when World War I breaks out, a wave of patriotism sweeps through most of his friends, and they begin supporting their own country's governments, and no longer working for the proletariat to overthrow those governments, but instead they're supporting those governments and hoping for victory of those governments in World War I. Well, this leaves Lenin feeling alone, feeling betrayed, and feeling like his revolution will never happen. What Lenin doesn't realize is that World War I is extremely unpopular in Russia among the peasants, and World War I is going to be the final straw that causes them to revolt against the czars. On March 8th through the 15th of 1917, in the city of Petrograd, Russia, Petrograd is now called St. Petersburg today, war-weary soldiers and war-weary peasants started protesting in the square of Petrograd, and they refused to leave. Even when the Tsar sent in soldiers to remove them, and those soldiers even shot some of them, they still refused to leave. And so in fear for his life, the Tsar abdicated the throne, meaning he said, hey, I'm no longer Tsar, and he left. And this began the February Revolution. Now I know what you're thinking. Wait a second, Mr. McGee. Didn't you say that the revolution took place March 8th through the 15th? Yeah, it did. But back in that time, Russia used the Julian calendar, which is different from the Gregorian calendar that we all use. So even though it took place March 8th through the 15th, it's called the February Revolution. The revolution in Petrograd soon spread to all the towns and cities in Russia. And in each city and town, once the authority had been deposed, they set up their own local council called a Soviet. That's why we talk about the Soviet Union today, the Union of Soviets, the Union of Local Councils. Now, if we jump back to World War I for a second, the Germans heard what was happening in Russia and they thought, yes, if this revolution can get going, then maybe Russia will pull out of World War I and we won't have to try to fight on the Eastern Front and the Western Front. So the Germans allowed Vladimir Lenin, who was living in Switzerland at the time, safe passage through Germany to then go to Sweden, and then from Sweden to go to Russia. So once again, we would like to thank the country of Germany for in the 20th century being the worst. So on April 16th, 1917, Vladimir Lenin arrives in Petrograd to help with the revolution. By the time Lenin arrives on April 16th, most of the major cities and towns have done what Petrograd did. Now, to Lenin's annoyance, the Soviets in the different towns, they, instead of taking over Russia themselves, they have created a provisional government. So in other words, a temporary government, and given power to that government. Lenin comes in, looks at that government and says, this is a bourgeoisie government made up of middle-class people. This isn't supposed to happen. It's supposed to be a direct dictatorship of the Soviets, of the councils. And so Lenin opposes that provisional government and says, no, all power must be with the peasants. It must be with the proletariat, not with this bourgeoisie council. And so this is going to set up a huge battle between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Lenin is the head of the Bolsheviks, and we'll explain what those two words mean. The names of these two groups goes back to early debates among Marxists regarding how to create a Marxist revolution. It doesn't really have anything to do with the 1917 debate. All right, so Bolshevik means majority, which is funny because at the beginning of the 1917 revolution, Lenin's Bolshevik group was in the minority. The word Menshevik means minority, which is also funny because in 1917, the Mensheviks were actually in the majority. So now that we know what those words mean, what did the two groups believe? Well, the Mensheviks believed that socialism should happen in stages. So they believed, hey, this provisional government, this bourgeois provisional government, is a good thing. Let it, with a little bit of capitalism, kind of help the country to stabilize, and then slowly but surely we'll have the proletariat take over. But we'll do it in stages. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, said, no, socialist revolution has to happen immediately. Power, this was Lenin's term, all power to the Soviets, meaning all power to those councils. The Soviets in the different towns needed to take power, and there needed to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and need to happen immediately. Now, if you're asking yourself, hey, Mr. McGee, well, which group was good, the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Neither. Okay, both of them are communists. Both of them believe in communism. Both of them believe in Karl Marx's vision, his ultimate vision of how a country should operate in terms of their economics. What they disagreed about was how to get there. So the Bolsheviks wanted to get to communism immediately. The Mensheviks want to get to communism through stages. So it's kind of like this. The Bolsheviks are driving a Ferrari off of a cliff. The Mensheviks want to drive a Prius off of the cliff. Now, the point is, they both end off of the cliff with lots of destruction and explosions and everyone's dead. The Bolsheviks just got there faster. Lenin also tried to convince the Soviets the Bolshevik way was best by the campaign slogan, peace, land, and bread. Peace meaning, hey, if the Bolsheviks are in charge, we will pull out of World War I. Land meaning the Bolsheviks will take over all the land. There will be no private property anymore, and we will redistribute the land out to the proletariat. Bread meaning by taking over the land, the Bolsheviks are going to have an agricultural program that will feed the entire population of Russia. By the end of September, Lenin has convinced most of the Soviets that the Bolshevik way is best, and those Soviets elect Bolshevik leaders. Once this happens, the provisional government's days are numbered, and on November 7th through the 8th, the Red Guard, which is the Bolshevik militia, they take over the government. They kick out the provisional leaders, and now the Bolsheviks are in charge of Russia, meaning Vladimir Lenin is now the dictator of the Soviet Union. Russia's name would be changed to the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Red Guard's takeover of the government and their kicking out of the provisional government, that would be referred to as the October Revolution. Even though it actually took place November 7th through the 8th, remember that Julian calendar that the Russians still have and not the Gregorian calendar. Just remember, the Russian Revolution takes place in two stages. The February Revolution, which actually takes place in March, which kicked out the czars and put in a provisional government, and then the October Revolution, which actually took place in November, that kicked out the provisional government and established Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks as the dictators of the Soviet Union. In the next episode, we'll take a look at Vladimir Lenin's rule in Russia, the effects of communism on Russia, and the eventual transition to the next dictator, Joseph Stalin. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them politely and respectfully in the description box below. My name's Mr. McGee. Take care.